We have this theme. We would like to welcome you all and welcome our panelists. The Bildner Center has been exploring on the Cuba project within the Bildner Center issues of economic transformation in Cuba, reforms, and we've been doing that for quite a while before anyone else was studying it in the US, and we are proud to have made a contribution in that regard in many conferences and seminars over the years. The Cuba seminars has been active in New York has been active since 1995, 96. So we have had a continuous run for all these years, and we're proud and happy to be able to keep playing that role for you and for us and for everybody. We are targeting the issue of economic reform because we think it's the most important aspect of the reform process in Cuba at this point. In future editions of our programs, we may focus on the politics or political economy of reform, transformation, and relationships with the area of culture, which we have also explored. Well, those of you who are interested in the issue of economic transformation will appreciate that we have on May 27th of 2014 a larger event. So today's event is really a kind of a planning component of that step toward that process or that occasion in which we will engage in a more systematic analysis of the themes that concern us today, which is the economic transformation outlook for 2014, and then taking stock of what has happened thus far. So today is just a stepping stone toward that analysis. So we're delighted to welcome Pavel Vidal, who will be the first speaker, sitting to the left. He's currently an associate professor of economics at the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana de Cali in Colombia, as well as adjunct research scholar at the Columbia University. He was a professor of the University of Havana from 2006 to 2012, and he worked very effectively and in a wonderful team at the University of Havana, the Center for the Study of the Cuban Economy, CEEC. And he just last year, as many young Cubans, decided to pursue his interest outside of the island, so he's now in Cali, Colombia. Mario Gonzalez Corso is Associate Professor of Economics at Lehman College, and he's an active collaborator of what we do here at the Bildner Center. And he's written extensively on agriculture and various aspects of the Cuban economy, remittances, and other topics. And we look forward to a strong set of events, discussions, many of which will be public, that in the weeks to come and the month to come. There may be some surprises for you that I think you'll appreciate. And then lastly, there's a fellow here called Mauricio Fon, who will also be presenting something, and that's me. But we'll leave that for last. And I think what we will do is start with Pavel, right? Pavel is going to address a very hot issue right now, which is currency reform, monetary reform in Cuba. Pavel.
Okay, well, I'm going to make my presentation in English. It's a little bit slow, but to keep my reputation up in the debate, I'm going to speak Spanish so I can improve my image. We have been talking about the monetary duality for a long time. Cuba has been bearing this strange situation of having two currencies and two exchange rates. In the early, the two currencies was the Cuban peso and the dollars. But after 10 years, the central bank implemented a de-dollarization process. So today, the monetary duality is a little bit more strange because it's the parallel circulation of two national currencies. The Cuban peso, or CUP, and the convertible peso, or CUC. So what I want to talk this afternoon is the process that the government is planning to implement for the next 3 years to move the economy to a single currency. The government of Fidel Castro did almost nothing to eliminate the monetary duality. However, with the Raúl Castro process of reform, the monetary duality, the elimination of monetary duality, seems to be a priority. We can see in that documents, famous documents, the guideline for the economic policy, social and economic policy up to 2016, that there is a chapter dedicated to the financial and monetary policy. In that chapter, there are two objectives. One is the microfinance, which is already in place. There is some small but positive outcome in the microfinance process. And there is a priority and a commitment, official commitment, to move the economy to a single currency. So far, the government, what has been doing is trying to run some experiments. And 2 months ago, the official Granma newspaper released an official note that gives like the go-ahead for the monetary reform. The guidelines and the overall process of reform has as deadline 2016. So we can assume that the monetary reform will share the same deadline. So we are expecting that Cuba, in 3 years now, will have again the Cuban peso as a single currency. I would like to, we don't know the details of that process of monetary reform. We know some consensus. We know that the government is trying to move the economy back to the Cuban peso. So the CUC is the currency that is going to disappear at some point. We know that the government is not planning to apply a big bang monetary reform. They are going to apply a gradual approach. But that gradual approach has a limit, which is 2016. And there is a big gap between the two exchange rates. So the government has to implement a huge devaluation in 3 years. So the reform, monetary reform, could be gradual, but not that gradual. It has to be tough for the enterprise system, the consequences of the devaluation. So I would like to talk in my presentation about the most likely actions and effects of this monetary reform. But for you to understand a little bit better the monetary reform, I need to start by explaining some characteristics of the monetary policy in Cuba, the tools, the transmission mechanism, the goals of the monetary policy in Cuba. Very briefly, because I only have 20 minutes. As Mauricio said, I used to work for the Central Bank of Cuba. So I have to recognize that the Central Bank of Cuba made some progress in the monetary policy strategy in the 90s. The Central Bank of Cuba was able to reduce the inflation in the 90s and was able to sustain the monetary stability. But I also have to recognize that the monetary policy did just a little progress in some aspects of the monetary policy, like transparency. We don't know the figures of the money supply in CUC. We don't know the figures of the foreign reserve held by the central bank, for example. And today, we don't know the details of the monetary reform. We know some aspects, but we don't know the details. The monetary policy didn't do any progress in the independence. The monetary policy in Cuba relies on the equilibrium of the fiscal deficit. Monetary policy in Cuba still is printing money to finance the fiscal deficit, the so-called monetization of the fiscal deficit. The Central Bank of Cuba is not been using the conventional monetary policy tools like open market operations. We still are using direct and unconventional monetary policy tools like controlling the level of salary, like controlling directly the exchange rates, the interest rates. It's like the monetary policy in Latin America in the 60s, in the 70s. The Central Bank of Cuba is not being using the conventional monetary transmission mechanism through the banking system and credit. We are trying to control directly the supply and demand in Cuban peso. To do that, the Central Bank of Cuba has some unusual tools, which is this one that I am showing in my slide, an estimation that I did with an econometric model. Then you can see the significant effects, the dynamic effects from 6 months to 1 year of this instrument. The central bank sells dollar to Minsin so that they can encourage the sales of Cuban pesos, of products in Cuban pesos. So the Central Bank of Cuba has not been controlling the money supply, buying and selling bonds, but buying and selling products, Cuban peso products. It's unusual, but it's been working. You can see in the data of the inflation that the Central Bank of Cuba, instead of this strange monetary policy strategy, has been able to reduce and control the inflation rates since 1994. In fact, low inflation is one of the advantages of the current economic reform in Cuba. We can see in the guidelines and the whole process of Raúl Castro's reform that the reform is not focused in a stabilization program. There is not need for a stabilization program because the inflation is low. So monetary and the economic policy can focus on the elimination of the dual currency, can focus on the liberalization process and the structural reforms. That's one of the advantages of the Cuban reform today if you compare with the reform in the early 90s. However, this inflation path can change. I mean, all the process of monetary reform would lead to a significant devaluation of the official exchange rate that can resulted in a higher inflation. And we can connect these figures with the roots, the origin of the monetary duality. In this period of high inflation, what happened in Cuba was that people started to substitute the US dollar by the Cuban peso because of the high inflation and also because of the devaluation of the exchange rate of the Cuban peso. People lost confidence in the Cuban peso and substitute to the US dollar. In this figure, we can find the reasons why Cuba has now two currencies. The monetary development in Cuba started as a process of partial dollarization. This dollarization started in the informal market, but later the government used the dollarization to promote stability, to promote a group of sectors that will be very important for the recovery of the crisis. The government used the US dollar to promote the entrance of remittances, to promote foreign direct investment, to promote export, to promote stability in the economy. So monetary development in Cuba started as a process of partial dollarization that at the beginning was an informal dollarization, but later it was an official dollarization. Monetary development in Cuba means two things. One is the dual currency, but at the same time we have a dual exchange rate system. And it also has to do with the crisis in the early 90s. We can see here the devaluation of the exchange rate that also started in the informal market, and after that, the government assumed that devaluation of the exchange rate. But in the case of the exchange rate, the devaluation was only assumed for the what we call in Cuba cadeca, which is the house, I don't know how to say in English, house of exchange rate, which is only using or applying operation with people and tourists. So the devaluation was never taken into the balance sheet financing or trade operation of the state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises, SOEs, are working even today with the exchange rates of the 80s. So we have a multiple exchange rate system. 1-to-1, 1 Cuban peso to the dollar, is the official exchange rate. And the other exchange rate is 24-to-1. But this exchange rate is only applying for tourists and people. So the Cuban's exchange rate adjustment in the 90s was incomplete, since it took place only in the household sector. Today, Raúl Castro's government has to implement the devaluation of the official exchange rate that did not happen in the early 90s and has been postponed for more than 20 years. After the partial dollarization of the economy, we have the parallel circulation of the Cuban peso and the dollar for 10 years, from 1993 to 2003. In 2003 and 2004, the Central Bank of Cuba implemented a de-dollarization process. But the USD was not replaced for the Cuban peso, but for a third currency, the CUC. That's how we were able to de-dollarize the economy, but the monetary duality remains. In the future, what the government is planning to do, to the best of my knowledge, is to move the economy back to the Cuban peso. So in the future, the CUC is going to disappear, and the economy will have as a single currency again the Cuban peso. On the other hand, the dual exchange rate system has not shifted at all in the last 20 years. To the best of my knowledge, I don't know the details, but I think that what the government is planning to do for the monetary reform is to increase this exchange rate, devalue the CUP against the dollar, but is planning to remain fixed this exchange rate, the CADEC exchange rate, and is also planning to keep fixed the CUC exchange rate. The main measure that the government is going to implement to get rid of the monetary duality is the devaluation only of the official exchange rate. I know that there is an expectation and people is looking forward to see a revaluation of the CADECA exchange rate. But in my opinion, that is not going to happen in the short term. Maybe that could be a medium-term effect, an aftermath of the monetary reform, but not a short-term impact. As I said, we don't know the details, but we know some consensus. We know that they are going to try to reestablish the COP as a single currency. They are trying to devalue the official exchange rate, and they are trying to do it as gradual as possible. The gradualism can be implemented with two options. One is the economy-wide gradualism, which means to be applying small but systematic devaluation of the exchange rate for all SOEs. But the approach that it seems to be the one that the government is going to take in place is try to select some enterprises and apply a stronger devaluation in those sectors. It means that they are going to use the most likely monetary strategy to eliminate the monetary duality will be a devaluation a strong devaluation in some sectors. So far, we know about some experiments that has been implemented in the relation between private farmers and cooperatives and the hotels in a group of SOEs in the sugar industry and in the transportation cooperative. In all the cases, they are not using the official exchange rate, but a more devaluated exchange rate. Except the case of the industry, of sugar industry, the average exchange rate that is using in that experiment is 10 Cuban pesos to 1 CUC and to $1. Consequently, the current signals point to a sector-by-sector monetary reform with a strong devaluation of 900% in the first stage of the reform. The devaluation of the official exchange rate will bring about cost and benefits. The devaluation of the official exchange rate will change all the financial situation of SOEs. The devaluation will put stress on the accounting and the financial situation of SOEs, especially especially in the balance sheet with that kind of situation of mismatched currency. Some SOEs with, that today have a profit will have to go into bankruptcy after the devaluation. That will be one of the costs. Another cost has to do with the so-called pass-through effects. If you devalue the exchange rate, that devaluation can go through all the enterprise system and resulted in higher prices for consumer. So the devaluation will have as another cost a higher inflation rate. The paradox is that all that costs are for a good end. This is an unavoidable shock, but that has to be applied in order to get more transparent and more transparent balance sheets and more transparent relative prices. So they can reflect the actual efficiency and productivity of the SOEs. This is one of the balance that have to be get for the government. They have to apply a shock, but that have to be a shock that can be managed for SOEs.
Ya.
No, I haven't finished.
¿Terminaste ya?
No.
Todavía. ¿Tiene 2 minutos?
2 minutos, okay.
Por ahí mejor 2, 3. I know it's very complicated, very fascinating stuff, central in the weeks to come. So please do take 3 of my minutes.
Okay. Of your minutes. So we have two costs, inflation and the effects on the balance sheets of enterprises. But at the same time, we will have some benefits. That benefits will be located in the exports, in the all the tradable sector. They will see after the devaluation some gain in profitability and competitiveness. The key point here is that we have to count on the response of SOEs. In any process of devaluation, you usually have losers and winners. Usually, the winners is the private sector, and the losers is the state sector. But in the case of Cuba, the private sector is already working with the devaluated exchange rate. I mean, micro enterprises, the cooperative are working with the exchange rate 24 to 1. So they will not receive any gain from the devaluation. We have costs and benefits, and the benefits of the devaluation depends on the response of SOEs. So that's why I am suggesting to implement the monetary reform together with structural reform in SOEs. SOEs needs autonomy to be able to react and to make the most of the devaluation. At the same time, it's important to line the incentive of workers in SOEs with the effects of the devaluation in the balance sheets of enterprises. I don't see any effects of the devaluation in foreign direct investment. I don't see any effects of the devaluation in the private sector, and I don't see any effects of the devaluation in the purchasing power of salary. I don't see any effects of the devaluation in the economic inequalities in Cuba. I think that the purchasing power of salary and inequality has nothing to do with the monetary duality. Another key point to use effectively another minutes is that with the devaluation, you will have a certain and short-term cost. And on the other hand, you will have potentials and medium-term benefits. So there is a gap between the cost and the benefits. And that's the place, the role that has to be played by the fiscal policy. The fiscal policy has to bridge this gap, this time gap between costs and benefits. And I will jump to the conclusions. I have to read it. I recommend a gradual approach for the Cuban monetary reform because of the structure of the economy based on SOEs, and because we don't have to be afraid of have any kind of speculation of related to capital inflow or capital outflow, because in Cuba we can control the capital movement. The government must announce the sequences of the monetary reform to reduce uncertainty, and the structural reform in SOEs must be implemented. Fiscal policy must bridge this gap between short-term costs and medium-term benefits. And the Central Bank of Cuba needs to enhance the monetary policy strategy in order to sustain the stability and credibility of the single currency, the Cuban peso, after 2016. Finish.
It's a very rich, very nuanced analysis of the situation of the dual currency reform in Cuba. Probably the key reform in the weeks and months to come, and years. I guess you said a margin of three years, huh? 2015. Pavel has identified likely winners and likely losers, and he has given us a very interesting study of or perspective on what we need to focus on in the near future. Mario, I mean, many of us think that a monetary reform has to happen with the reforms in the production systems, and they would be unthinkable unless they happen at the same time. We need to have more production to sustain these major transformations of the economy, of the currency. We see that in Latin America and other experiences where attempts at manipulating with monetary policy has led to inflation, very high inflation, explosive inflation in the 80s and parts of the 90s and before. And only when that was accompanied by sustained expansion in the productive sector were you able to accomplish the dual goals of growth, reform, and structural reform and monetary reform. Mario is going to dwell on one aspect of the reforms in Cuba that is perhaps central also to this whole equation that I used to sketch to you, which is a transformation of the agricultural sector. Mario?
Thank you. All right, so. Okay, so thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, and I want to say that it's a pleasure to have Pavel here, who is a friend and a colleague from a long time. It's also a pleasure to have everyone here. Back in September, we had a panel in which I presented the chapter that I wrote in the Handbook of Cuban Studies book that we published, which was basically an overview of the agricultural reforms in Cuba. And so when we organized this panel, I offered to talk about agriculture, but I promised to try to at least say a few new things. And so that's the purpose of my presentation today. So basically, three topics in my presentation. The first one is how I looked at official statistics from about Cuban agriculture, and I found some new data regarding land under cultivation and of course, production, right? So that will be the first topic. And then, of course, the second topic is to talk a little bit about the principal regulatory updates, and there are 3 updates, basically, dating back to the late summer. The first one is sales of agricultural products to tourism enterprises. The second one is a bigger one, which is the commercialization of agricultural products, a change in the supply chain, if you will. And the third one is one that's pretty much forthcoming, which is the restructuring of the Ministry of Agriculture. And then in the final topic, I'll talk about what I perceive to be the outlook for 2014. Let me preface my presentation also by saying that I will talk about non-sugar agricultural production. So it doesn't include the industrial component, it doesn't include the sugar component. So in terms of land under cultivation, what I did was I found some data for the first quarter of 2013. And if you look at the tables here, you'll notice that for most of the crops, basically land under cultivation declined. And we see notable decreases in potatoes, plantains, tomatoes, and so on, right? Viandas, which is a whole bunch of staples that are vital to the Cuban diet. So what I found was, without getting into the econometrics of it, is that this had a negative impact on output, and I'll show you the data for output shortly, but it had a positive impact on yield as long as the rate of change in production was greater than the negative rate of change or reductions in land under cultivation. So in other words, we'll notice, and if you compare the Cuban agricultural sector to other agricultural sectors, you'll notice that this is a typical trend, right? To reduce the amount of land dedicated to agriculture. Not surprisingly, I looked at output and I found 3 things that I'm highlighting here. So there's a total production compared to the first quarter of last year. So there you see the total production, and then it's broken down by state sector and the non-state sector. And every time when I compare the state sector and the non-state sector, the numbers that appear on red are the percentages in which one of the 2 had a lowest result during the first quarter of 2013. And so just a couple of things I want to highlight from here. One of them, of course, is that if you look at total output, right, and you compare the first quarter of 2012 versus the first quarter of 2013, you'll notice that in the same crops where land declined, production also declined. I mean, that's normal. That's to be expected. There's less land allocated to agricultural production, and therefore the impact would be less production, okay? So notice the very significant decreases in corn, in plantains, in potatoes, viandas, etc. You notice also that there's some sectors or some crops in which actually the state produces more output than the non-state sector. All right, so this is part of the transformation of agriculture where the production is being realigned by sector. Of course, if you look at total production from the crops that I have here, there are only a few that perform better than they did in 2012. So what are the key takeaway points in terms of production, looking at this very limited data that we have for the first quarter of 2013? Right? Which, by the way, was not published by September, so I couldn't include this in our work that we did in September. But I noticed that in crops in which the state sector exceeded the non-state sector, typically, if you look at the non-state sector, we have the UBPCs, right? The Unidades Básicas de Producción Cooperativa. And those, my take on this data is that the UBPCs are actually dragging down the non-state sector. In other words, if you take them out of the equation, and I know they've been transformed recently, non-state production would increase. Or let me put it differently, the indicators of non-state production will be different than what the table is showing here. The other key takeaway point is that if you look at rice and corn, I call them transition crops, not transition in the traditional sense of transition, but basically where the shifting composition of these crops, it's being manifested through the production data. Meaning, for example, if you look at rice production, the non-state sector produced more, right? Or we can look at the rates and we can say, well, non-state production was actually bigger. The opposite happens with corn. In the case of corn, state production was greater than non-state production. So this is typical in agricultural transformations, or what some people like to call post-socialist agricultural transformations, where you have some crops that are being realigned. And so in the case of Cuba, rice and corn are two examples of those crops. So then I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the regulatory updates. There's a lot to say about these. I'm sure some of you, if not most of you, are familiar with some of these updates, but I want to highlight the first update is basically direct sales of agricultural products to tourism enterprises. I mean, this is new. This is part of the change of the intermediation process and the supply chain of agricultural products. So there are a couple of things that I wanted to highlight here under key provisions. One of them is the expanded product category. And what this is basically pointing out, highlighting in my view, is sort of the micro-oriented nature of the transformations in the agricultural sector. I mean, specifically, they're saying these are the product categories that could be sold directly to the tourism enterprises. As Pavel mentioned, this is an example of gradualism. I also say this is an example of I don't want to say micromanaging, but the micro focus of the agricultural reforms. Another key point here is that prices follow Resolution 9, which was implemented in June of 2013, and there is a flexibilization of prices. So we can say, well, there is a price reform or a gradual or partial price reform because prices could be directly determined now by buyers and sellers, buyers being the tourism enterprises subject to the MINTUR, and sellers being state and non-state agricultural producers and intermediaries. A final point here, so I can move on to to the more significant change. A final point here is regarding tax payments and collection. And so basically, Casa Financiera del Turismo, FinTur, and the banking system now have a sort of tax collection function. So this is very unusual in these kinds of agricultural reforms, but it's there, and they're alluding to Decree Law 113, which was approved back in 2012, which talks about the tax collection system. Now, the other, and I wrote a lot about this here, the other reform, policy reform or policy measure, regulatory update is commercialization, this experiment of commercialization of agricultural products. I called it direct commercialization, and in essence, I'm referring to Decree Law 318, which is basically an experimental measure that has been implemented in Havana. As you know, Cuba has restructured its provinces, so Havana, Artemisa, Mayabeque, and so on. And another key point here is that there's a plan to expand this nationwide by 2015. So what does this mean, basically? To summarize all the bullet points that I have here, one meaning of this is that it means decentralization of the commercialization of agriculture. And you can find a reference to that in the lineamientos 183 and 181. 181 talks about calibrating supply and demand, making sure that through a more flexible system of commercialization, supply and demand are better calibrated. And Lineamiento 183 really goes right after what they call more efficient agricultural commercialization, meaning dismantling the state, the functions of acopio and so on, not dismantling, but restructuring acopio as well, and basically expanding the commercialization of agricultural products. Another key point here about decentralization is this creation of provincial administration councils that will really now at a decentralized level, not at the Ministry of Agriculture, the administration councils will be responsible for implementing Decree Law 318. Something else that actually caught my eye was that here we go with a very micro detailed list of products that are not subject to this new regulatory update. So beef, milk, coffee, honey, tobacco, cocoa, etc., are excluded from this regulation. And potatoes are subject to social consumption requirements, which means the fulfillment of contracts between producers and the state so that potatoes are delivered to centers of social consumption, hospitals, schools, daycare centers, and so on. All right? So I continue with the same decree, which to me is the most significant update since September. And now we talk about who are the authorized participants. And here's the list. We have the state sector. And of course, what's new about this is the non-state sector. So which includes the UBPCs, the cooperativas de producción agrícola, the cooperativas de créditos y servicios, private farmers, self-employed workers who are not farmers, who are basically private intermediaries. The resolution talks about carretilleros, but it's more than the carretilleros. It's actually private individuals who are licensed to commercialize, to sell, to broker agricultural products. Something else that caught my eye that I think it's new is what are the retail outlets? And the one that's there on the top of my list, which are the mercados agropecuarios estatales, are being transformed into what are called non-agricultural cooperatives. So these are basically now no longer, although the title remains in some cases and so on. Just to give you an update, there's 77 of those in Havana, and I counted 22 in Artemisa and Mayabeque. So we're talking about 99 mercados agropecuarios that have been sort of transformed into non-agricultural cooperatives. And also a new development is the mercados arrendados, which are basically these newly created markets or outlets that are leased by the state to the non-state producers. I want to pause here and say that there's a quote by Marino Murillo where he talks about changing gestión or changing management functions, administrative functions, without changing or altering the property forms in agriculture. So that's something to bear in mind. It's not just sin prisa pero sin pausa and all that kind of stuff, but it's also the conceptual framework of changing the management of agricultural enterprises, changing the managerial practices, administrative practices, but not changing radically the property form. That's a key point behind all these regulatory updates. Retail prices are divided into two categories, those that are fixed by the Ministry of Finance and those that could be negotiated between sellers and buyers. Another development are the mercados de abastos, which are basically, I guess in English I call them wholesale outlets or wholesale markets. I think outlets would be probably better. They're located in Havana only as an experiment, and this is basically where enterprises, this is not at the retail level, this is at the wholesale level, enterprises can come and purchase agricultural products directly at wholesale prices from the producers, right? Including, and not only from the producers, but I'm going to harp on it again, including intermediaries. And so at the bottom here, we see intermediaries and we see new forms of intermediation, which is also new, which are self-employed workers that are licensed to be agricultural intermediaries and cooperatives. And in parentheses, I put there that the cooperatives are exempt from paying sales taxes for the first 3 months as a way to incentivize the development of these kind of intermediary-based cooperatives. The minister did say in a speech that the updated agricultural model would give a greater priority to cooperatives rather than self-employed workers. So they receive preferential tax treatment, and down the line, there are many different reforms coming, I think, to give priority to cooperatives. Then the third leg of this update is the planned restructuring of the Ministry of Agriculture. And it's broken down into 3 phases. As you can see there, we have the budget system first quarter, next month of 2014 to the first quarter of 2015, updating, modernizing the budget system, transforming that system. The second phase is the creation of provincial enterprises, empresas provinciales, something new also, from the second quarter of 2014 to the second quarter of 2015. And then phase 3, replacing the provincial and municipal delegations and so on. But if you look on the other measures, I found these two to be very significant, right? Provincial enterprises will be transferred away from the ministry to provincial administration, and the fusion of 15 agricultural research stations. As most of you probably know, Cuba has developed an extensive degree of experience in agricultural research. And so they're now looking at, joining those stations with some from the Ministry of Science, Technology, and the Environment. So that's sort of like an administrative reform. So the question that came up, the theme of our panel is, what is the outlook for 2014? And it's difficult, right, when you have such a complex system as agriculture. But a few points here. I think there will be a continued emphasis on updating the agricultural supply chain and distribution network. So Resolution 318 expanded, modified, or as the Cubans like to say, perfected, right? Getting closer to perfection. Another outlook, or part of the outlook, is if we look at output, the same trend: lower output, higher yields as land is reduced and as the reduction of land is greater than the declines in output. Okay, in output. Another component, I think, will be the expansion of agricultural input markets, but with limited results because of some existing constraints and so on. The other point, I think, another significant element in the agricultural sector in 2014, if we look forward, I think it's reasonable to expect a gradualist approach to restructuring using experiments, right? The Cubans seem to discover that experiments are a good way to see if things are going to work. So I mentioned here an experiment that's taking place in the Isla de la Juventud, which is basically creating input markets where agricultural producers, state and non-state agricultural producers, can buy inputs, a list of inputs at fair prices or moderate prices in Cuban currency, right? We're talking on monetary duality, so this is an experiment. The next point, I think that I read a couple of reports from people in agriculture in Cuba, and they're saying that the market will continue to be, the wholesale market and the retail market will remain segmented into different delivery channels or retail channels to ensure competition. I don't remember exactly who said this, but there was an official who basically made this comment, which I found that I agree with, because it would be very difficult to unify. If monetary unification is difficult, imagine unifying all those markets. That's also a big project. So I have a couple of questions sort of thinking ahead towards 2014, and one of them is, will there be an extension of Decree Law 318? Meaning, will they continue to expand the commercialization of agricultural products? Will it be rolled out nationally, and what would be the impact of that? My other question has to do with Decree Law 300, which came out in October of last year, which is basically expanding the transfer of idle state lands to cooperative, to non-state producers on their usufruct. So my question is, will that continue, right? I haven't read much about that. That's just a question that came up. And then, of course, the final question mark relates to the Ministry of Agriculture and the restructuring of the Ministry of Agriculture. Will that be executed during the time frame that, a very aggressive time frame announced by the Cubans? So I conclude my presentation saying that the big question mark in agriculture is, where else can agriculture go? So thank you very much. Okay.
Gracias, Mario. With the complexities in the reform process in Cuba, and yet evidence of major change, I'm almost tempted to, perhaps with some sense of humor in relation to New York City, call the situation in Cuba a tale of two brothers. Fidel Castro, as I will attempt to show, insisting on a very centralized model, and then Raúl Castro, as Pavel emphasized, insisting on a reform process involving decentralization, new forms of production, currency reform, and the like. So And so I will start with the same kind of introduction that I used last time here, then I will shift the emphasis. There's a serious reform process, reform drive, actualización, updating, lineamientos, sin prisa pero sin pausa, gradualism has been reaffirmed by both speakers before me. And then a series of reforms. It reminds us of the competition between reform processes, Cuba and the Soviet Union, the hare and the rabbit, and the rabbit being the shock therapy of the Eastern Bloc and Russia, and which one will come ahead and win in the end. What happened here, Jonathan? Jump to the end. You want to help me out? I think I can do it. Okay, so how do we get it to play? But we missed the prior one. Yeah. So I hit here, right? So Raul Castro's approach performed like the fabled tortoise, then in the end beat the hare's big bang to the finish line. Well, as we know, few at least, of the Eastern European countries, including Russia, faced years of abyss and collapse and failure. Will Cuba's gradualism be able to evade or prevent that from happening in Cuba? And will Cuba, therefore, will be able to come ahead and finish with a degree of success in the reform process? I think to make sense of that in a broader context, you need to look at what happened after 1986. And again, tale of two brothers. In 95, when Russia went and this old Soviet Union went through a reform process, Cuba insisted on reaffirmation of traditional centralization, and the elements of that reaction at that time are listed here. It was the Third Congress of the Communist Party, rectificación, and it was a reaffirmation of the policies of the past, a critique of bureaucracy, meaning kind of planning, modern planning like the Soviets. Material incentives and farmers' market were to be rejected in favor of more return to volunteer work, agrarian collectivization, rekindling of foreign incentives, and the primacy of politics over economic considerations. And throughout this whole process, a reaffirmation of Fidel Castro's personal leadership and style of building socialism in Cuba, still adapted practices from below, which we deal with in another presentation, could not be stopped. The whole story, as Pavel and both Pavel and Mario insisted, it starts with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then the decrease in output in the Cuban economy, which was real in just about all sectors, services, industry, and agriculture. It was a 35% contraction at least, perhaps more. And then we see a very interesting period, which is a special period, and we all know this, but essentially the elements of, and I think Pavel alluded to this and Mario as well, the elements of the current reform process, which starts later, get defined at that time. And it was some degree of liberalization, expanded foreign investments, tourism, farmers markets, remittances, and legalization of the dollar. And Pavel, told us how those measures at that time were designed to the exchange rates to provide incentives for both those direct foreign investment and remittances. The crisis of the Cuban economy is major. The sugar production collapses just brutally from 8 million to 1 million or so, 1,000 tons. And so do exports. And of course, they lose out to Brazil, which wins out in this particular race. Now, what is interesting is that the initial reform phase, and again, we are revisiting this, I think we need to keep going back to this. is the socialist reaffirmation that happens again in 1995, after 1997. And Fidel Castro again takes the helm and insists on the battle of ideas to return to post-1999 mass mobilizations, Elian Gonzalez case, Hugo Chavez elected in 1998, very important episode in this whole equation. And then it's only Fidel Castro's illness in 2006 that brings an end to this cycle of alternations. The question that I pose for you is, will this cycle of reform, stop-go reforms continue in Cuba, or will it be broken now by Raul Castro's reforms? The elements of there's a constitutional revision 2002, reaffirming socialism as the fundamental form of organization of the Cuban economy. There are prohibits in international negotiations, while Cuba is subject to aggression, threat, or coercion from a foreign power. But the main thing is the emphasis on socialism. The reform process that we have been discussing starts in 2008 with Raul Castro. And we all know what the main elements of that whole process is, so I'm going to rush through. We don't have that much time. The reality of it is that the economy transforms itself, and you see the services sector in the year after 1997 take off. This is the services abroad mostly, and tourism, expanding very fast in Cuba. So Cuba becomes a service-oriented export economy in many ways, if you focus on tourism and medical services to Venezuela and other places. Now, let's look at this very fast. I mean, this is not very fast, actually, with some attention. This period of socialist reaffirmation, which ends in 2008, 2009, but then there is kind of a inertia. Look at the labor force employed by the state. It had decreased to 76.9% in 1997 as a result of the special period. And then you see it grow again because of this relationship to Venezuela and the reaffirmation of the state. 79% to 79, 80, 82, peaks in about 2009 with 83.8, and then it begins to contract. There are some different data. I'm drawing from Rundenius and from 97, 2007, and 2010, and the rest of the data come from ONE, the statistical office in Cuba. So the non-state sector, again, expands in the 90s, then contracts to release because this is being centralized, and then it's beginning to grow again. And actually, people are saying that the aim is to 20%, but the data that we have from ONES itself is 22.3%. So it seems that indeed the private economy, the non-state economy, in terms of employment, is expanding. But again, that shows you the two very different styles of organizing the Cuban economy. One centralized, in which labor is, the state is responsible for employing people, and one in which the non-state sector is really drawing a lot of the labor and increasing the rapidity. So presumably what we will have to look forward to in the years to come will be an expansion of this process. The debate continues, propositions, we don't have time for this. I think I want to rush because we want to open up the question and answer period. And I had some data indicators. I think there has been an acceleration of reform, at least in terms of the declaration of intent in 2013. It includes, as Mario pointed out, food distribution networks and wholesale markets, the cooperatives, both agricultural and non-agricultural, deregulation of state enterprises, and travel liberalization, and migration, very important item in there. Eliminating food subsidies, the ration card for direct investment is being encouraged. We have a study that in progress on what we are likely to expect from the Mariel special zone, whatever term you want to prefer to use. And then there's an overall private sector expansion. And there are other measures under study. Again, today we are just presenting this, we're taking stock of what has happened and is likely to happen in the near future. In May, we will have a colloquium that hopefully will go more in more depth and address some of the progress that has been made in these areas. Again, we don't have time for the progress. We just reviewed them and each of the areas that I just mentioned. Mariel, we went through that, and I think on the Mariel issue, one of the questions for me is the extent to which the Mariel investments will be only for foreigners as opposed to Cubans. If you really look carefully at the Chinese, which is the model that is being used in Cuba, we are told, the Chinese experiences, yes, it was used to attract foreign investment for exports, but it was also a vehicle for training a national and a Chinese class of entrepreneurs that took root and grew very rapidly in a matter of 15, 20 years. And the question that I have in mind is whether Cuba is going to also experience, or whether the policymakers have a sense of commitment to also something like that. I'm not sure about Vietnam, that you've been studying Vietnam reforms and their application to Cuba. It may be interesting to ask ourselves to the extent to which Vietnam is also encouraging Vietnamese national capital as opposed to just foreigners, and having an enclave economy, again, returning to foreign investors. Not very different from the past, is it? Or maquilas or something like that. So is there something beyond that we can look forward to? Well, I mean, again, just to reaffirm the recent reforms, so the dual currency is ending. I think what I like to say is just that, again, a tale of two brothers. Pardon me, New Yorkers. Will Cuba really shift with Raul, or will it stay in this vaivén? I mean, at the end of 2013, we also saw reaffirmations of, or at least a sense of putting a brake on reform process on theaters and 3D theater and homes, selling state merchandise bought at state enterprises, and what else? Imports, Mario, of certain clothing and so on. So a reaffirmation of restrictions on the non-state sector in 3 or 4 main areas. So what is happening in Cuba? Do we have this impulse to reform, which is also accompanied by a sense of a break, a sense of ambivalence, a sense of, gosh, let's preserve socialism? Do we have two forces at play, perhaps the two brothers, aligned with the two brothers? Well, I just put in the question, there are certainly two sets of views in Cuba, and one of them is reformist, and we can see that in this tale, and one that is not as optimistic about reforms. And I think that's also something to be watched in the month and weeks to come. And I certainly will be looking at this, many of us will be looking at this in a very careful way. But again, the main thing is here is what's happening in Cuba, not what we wish that happens. And we can come back in May and we can address these issues jointly. Va a responder en español, so he's
making a presentation in English.
If you need a translation, we will provide one for you, and maybe this guy from New Jersey.
I think that both that make the question I understand in Spanish. Siempre ha habido esa discusión si hay que esperar que mejore la economía y mejore la productividad para eliminar la dualidad monetaria, o si hace falta eliminar la dualidad monetaria para que mejore la productividad. Entonces siempre ha habido esa discusión. Yo trabajé en el Banco Central durante 6 años y siempre prevalecía esperar el mejor momento donde estuviesen las mejores condiciones. Pero esa no era la posición del Banco Central y es la mía también. En la economía, lo primero que uno tiene que hacer es medir bien las cosas, medir bien la eficiencia, medir bien la productividad, saber qué empresas son rentables, cuáles no son rentables, y a partir de ahí viene toda la toma de decisiones y toda la asignación de recursos. Hoy, con el tipo de cambio 1 a 1, todo eso está distorsionado. Si todo lo que estamos midiendo está mal, las decisiones que se están tomando probablemente la mayoría estén equivocadas, la asignación de recursos es completamente ineficiente. Por tanto, creo que hay hoy ese consenso de empezar la reforma monetaria, aun cuando Cuba no está en su mejor momento. De hecho, 2014 va a ser un año muy complicado. Cuba no tiene reservas internacionales, Cuba no tiene la ayuda de ninguna institución financiera internacional. Es decir, va a ser muy difícil. Es decir, las condiciones para implementar la reforma monetaria son las peores, pero no queda otra opción que hacerlo, ¿no? Yo creo que no hay otra opción que hacerlo. Y sí creo, como intenté explicar, que en un primer momento ese proceso de evaluación va a ser estresante para la economía, va a tener más costos que beneficios, pero creo que a mediano plazo, si se logra sobrepasar ese difícil momento, porque van a ser 3 años de mucha tensión en la economía. Es decir, si se devalúa la moneda empezando por 900%, va a haber mucha tensión en la economía. Y hay muchas acciones que hay que tomar. Entre ellas, las reformas estructurales en la empresa, porque son las empresas estatales las que tienen que producir la ganancia, es decir, tomar los beneficios de la devaluación, de manera tal que esos beneficios superen a los costos, que van a ser difíciles. Pero hay hoy ese consenso y me parece adecuado empezar ya, es decir, un asunto que se ha pospuesto desde los años 90. Y la economía realmente es muy difícil. Todas las distorsiones que acumula, ¿no? ese tipo de cambio 1 a 1 tiene grandes costos para la economía. La relación entre desigualdades, poder adquisitivo del salario y la dualidad monetaria es un tema para mucha discusión, crea muchas expectativas. Empiezo analizando eso. Eso puede ser incluso, lo mencioné en algún momento y se reflejó en la prensa, ¿no? que puede ser hasta un tema de manejo político. Es decir, la población está esperando demasiado de la eliminación de la doble moneda. Y está esperando demasiado porque se vinculan las desigualdades con la doble moneda. Por esa misma intuición, ¿no? La familia que recibe dólares o recibe remesas está en mejores condiciones que la familia que solo recibe pesos. Entonces, tal parece que la desigualdad es por la doble moneda. Pero hay que ir un paso más adentro. Es decir, ¿de dónde vienen los dólares y de dónde vienen los pesos? Entonces, los dólares vienen de las remesas y los pesos vienen de los salarios. Entonces, la desigualdad no está originada por las monedas, sino por la fuente de ingreso. Entonces, y si sigues más atrás, entonces tienes que ver por qué el salario es tan bajo. El salario es bajo porque hay una productividad baja. ¿Y por qué hay productividad baja? Porque el sistema estatal es completamente ineficiente. Entonces, ahí tú puedes sacar una conclusión de que un sistema que ha tratado de promover igualdad en la sociedad, estatizando la economía, por ese exceso de estatización, tiene como resultado que su sistema es tan bajo productivo que paga tan bajos salarios que genera desigualdades. Entonces, el sistema cubano estructuralmente genera esas desigualdades y eso no cambia con la doble moneda. Si tiene un efecto, la doble moneda, los beneficios de eliminar la doble moneda están en la empresa. Entonces, la empresa se beneficia, aumenta su productividad. Esperemos pero ahí están los detalles de la reforma monetaria. Si las empresas que se benefician con la devaluación se les permite que paguen más salarios, entonces sí puede haber incluso ahí un vínculo, romper ese círculo vicioso, ¿no? Un vínculo directo entre la devaluación y el aumento de salarios. Pero siempre serían efectos indirectos y a través de los efectos que la devaluación produce en la empresa. Pero no habría ese efecto mágico que están esperando las personas. Creo que también por esa expectativa de que se identifique el peso cubano con el nivel de vida y los estándares de los años 80. Entonces, esa impresión, pero bueno, ya eso no es análisis económico, eso es, no sé, especulación de que la gente espera que si el gobierno es capaz de llevar la economía al peso cubano, estaría llevando la economía y los niveles de vida a los de los años 80. Entonces la gente identifica un poco la reforma monetaria con el peso cubano y con los años 80. Entonces ahí hay una brecha, ¿no?, entre expectativas y objetivos que se pueden alcanzar, que tienen que manejarse de manera, eso es político, no es economía, sino política. En cuanto a los cines 3D y el tema de la venta de ropa, yo creo que el gobierno lo que está haciendo es, yo no estaría tan pesimista, es decir, yo creo que se han exagerado un poco las reacciones y lo que eso significa. Yo creo que el gobierno está en un proceso de liberalización y tiene, por supuesto, miedo, tiene preocupaciones de que las cosas se les vayan de las manos. Entonces, yo pienso que esto que ha sucedido es un poco un mensaje que yo tengo dos interpretaciones. Una es esa, que el gobierno está mandando un mensaje que tal vez hace tiempo tiene deseos de enviar, ¿no? Un mensaje de que ellos son los que que ellos controlan el alcance y la velocidad de los cambios. Estamos mandando un mensaje no de que hay una contrarreforma, sino que ellos tienen el control del proceso de liberalización. Y lo segundo, y tiene que ver con la burocracia, vinculo eso con la pregunta de la burocracia, que evidentemente en Cuba el proceso de cambio no es solo un proceso de cambio económico, sino que hay un proceso de reforma institucional. Si hay nuevas reglas, tienen asociados nuevos valores, nueva ideología, lo que se está poniendo en práctica durante muchos años estuvo completamente satanizado por el discurso político. Entonces, hay resistencias al cambio, es una economía que está intentando llevar a cabo un proceso de reforma con un sector estatal muy grande, donde hay una burocracia que evidentemente tiene miedo de tener pérdidas, de perder en el proceso de reforma. No es como Vietnam, que los vietnamitas, es decir, siempre la pregunta en Vietnam es si había oposición a los cambios, y en realidad en Vietnam uno ve que el proceso fue más fácil que en Cuba, debido al punto de partida. ¿Sí? Los vietnamitas no tenían prácticamente nada que perder, es decir, venían de una guerra, de un país destruido, pero en Cuba hay todavía, ¿no?, a pesar del deterioro y las deficiencias, ¿no?, que van sucediendo, todavía la población percibe un grupo de beneficios sociales que tiene miedo de perder en el proceso de reforma. Hay, por tanto, contradicciones, y este ejemplo de los cines 3D y la ropa es parte de esas contradicciones. Es decir, los cines 3D le quitan espacio al Ministerio de Cultura, ¿no?, y a los cines estatales, y la venta de ropa le quita espacio a la venta de ropas a partir de las cadenas estatales. Entonces también es un reflejo de esas contradicciones y de esa burocracia. Yo no vería ningún efecto en el corto plazo de la devaluación en el costo del turismo. Si no veo, es que faltan muchos detalles, ¿no? Pero en un primer momento, como la devaluación es solo la tasa de cambio oficial, yo creo que no tendría directamente un efecto sobre el costo del turismo, que más que todo está asociada a la tasa de cambio del peso convertible. Entonces no vería ese costo.
Okay, so I'll respond. I was thinking about the the question that always comes up in most conferences or presentations about Cuba, about the accuracy of Cuban statistics, and I want to give you 4 examples from agriculture. The first one, the data that I cited, that I presented here, in terms of output and land, excludes parcels and backyards, right, and organoponicos and so on. So basically, it understates, as the gentleman probably implied in his question, the real output in the economy. So the agricultural output data doesn't include those. So that's the first example. The second example is that if we look at sales, the Cuban government compiles a fairly comprehensive data series of sales in the agricultural markets by the state sector and the non-state sector. Well, the data, another example of the issue with statistics is that the data for the state sector overstates the production of the state, or the deliveries and sales of the state sector. And the reason is that in that data, we count the amount of output sold to the state by the non-state sector. So if we're counting sales without counting the origin, without separating, glossing out where the output came from, and we're aggregating sales, obviously those data overstate state sales in the agricultural market, or state sector sales in the agricultural market. The third example is when we look at the non-state sector, in every metric, it includes, in non-sugar agriculture, it includes, and also in sugar agriculture, the UBPCs, right? And the UBPCs were created back in 1993, and basically they were state farms that were converted into a new form of cooperative, right? So they have less autonomy and tend to be less efficient, so therefore, as I mentioned in my presentation, they drag down the performance of the non-state sector. And then the final example is one that I've been trying to work with, and I haven't been able to figure it out what to do. And it has to do with agricultural data too. It's when you look at private or non-state production and yield, right? The Cubans aggregate the production by the cooperativas de créditos y servicios, the CCSs, and the private farmers. So I wanted to know what is the contribution of the private farmers to the agricultural economy in terms of output, in terms of yield, and so on, but I'm unable to find that. Or anyone who studies agriculture in Cuba, the way that the data is, it's presented there, it's unable to find it. So basically, yeah, these are data, statistical issues. Nonetheless, though, the data series are getting better in terms of the consistency of the reporting by category. So there are issues with the definitions and how the data is calculated and so on, but the categories have remained pretty much the same, so which facilitates analysis. In an ideal world, and just to conclude, I'm going to say it would be wonderful to be able to obtain a breakdown of the non-state sector with the UBPCs, on the side, and then the CPAs, the CCSs, and the farmers, the private farmers by themselves. Now it's going to get more complicated with the non-agricultural cooperatives, which, by the way, perform an intermediation function. So how do we account for that output that is produced there in terms of services and so on? So a lot of studying coming forward. In fact, let me just say this, that in the May conference, I'm working on a project which is basically to present an overview of Cuban agricultural data, because I feel that there's a lot to be explained and studied and discussed there. So thank you for the question. I'll pass it on to you.
Gracias, Mario. Thanks. I actually want to start a second cycle of questions with one for Pavel. Pavel, in that tension that you pose between productivity and monetary reform, which one goes first, chicken and the egg problem, right? And you alluded to how the Cubans decided to go with the monetary reform first. But then you highlighted the importance, and in my view, very much correctly, of increased production and productivity. In that framework, assuming also that Mariel is a key component of what's likely to happen in 2014, how will the monetary reform affect, in terms of incentives, the investments that Mariel would need to have to be a success and to make a difference in productivity and production in the Cuban economy? So that will be my question to start a second set of round of questions. We have somebody here from another Cuban from the University of Havana, trained by the same shop as Pavel, and that's Zaira Pons, and we're happy to have you here. Zaira, welcome. And Zaira wants to have a question or a comment.
Voy a hablar en español igual, una pregunta para Pavel y una para Mario. La primera para Pavel es ¿cómo afectaría el escenario de unificación un shock externo? Digamos, en el 2014 un recorte importante de las importaciones que se traduzca en una desaceleración del PIB y por ende, digamos, un déficit fiscal. Y entonces, o sea, si aumenta, digamos, rápidamente el déficit fiscal debido a estos shocks externos, se genera, digamos, que una especie de desestabilización financiera interna adicional al escenario de unificación. ¿Cómo afectaría, digamos, eso, las proyecciones de ir hacia una sola moneda? Y luego la pregunta para Mario es por qué, en su opinión, el sector agrícola ha respondido, digamos, de forma incluso negativa a los diferentes cambios que se han ido haciendo. Porque en las primeras slides veíamos que las producciones de las viandas y demás habían decrecido de forma importante. O sea, ¿por qué este sector está reaccionando de esta manera a los cambios que se están llevando a cabo?
Did you get her question, or you all understood their question, right? Good. Another question or comment? So we have 3 questions there. You want to comenzar tú hasta ahora?
Ok, bueno, te voy a responder en español para practicar un poco, ¿no?
No, chico, hablo inglés, hay gente que no
Okay,
le...
I'll reply in English because, to practice English, my 5th language or something like that. The question was about why the relatively slow and negative response of the agricultural sector to the reforms and to the updates and changes. I could think of 3 reasons, right? The first one is the current conditions of the agricultural sector. And I'm talking about the material conditions of the infrastructure, the difficulty in getting inputs, fuel, fertilizer. Okay, so that's one reason. The second reason is one that's more demographic. And I think Armando Nova at the University of Havana has done a lot of work on this, talking about descampesinación or something. Nunca lo puedo pronunciar bien. But what it means is the migration of the rural population away from the countryside in Cuba. And I happen to come from an agrarian part of Cuba, and I travel to Cuba 2-3 times a year. And a lot of my friends want to leave, you know, and don't want to work in agriculture. So it's also a demographic, it's also a perception too that agriculture, even with the changes, entails a lot of work. So I would say the demographics, the physical conditions of the infrastructure and the lack of material input or the difficulties, and then the third is financial. The still fairly primitive system of credit and financing to facilitate the expansion of agriculture production, not only non-state, but also the state sector has problems with agriculture, with agricultural financing. And it's not only microcredit or microfinancing, it's beyond that. And there's a fourth one, which the Cubans like to call the los atrasos, los impagos, no, the arrears. It's very difficult for people to say, I want to join a sector where the government gives me a contract and I have to fulfill the contract. And then when I fulfill the contract, they don't pay me. It takes them a long time to pay me, right? And then, of course, finally, property forms or the permanence or non-permanence of property, right? And I'm thinking of the usufructuarios and their investment of time, effort. Anyone here who's been to the countryside and I done some labor, and it's not romantic, it's very hard work and to build and so on. And so people do this, I assume, this rational calculus and say, well, why would I want to go to that sector, right? So it's a confluence of factors. So thank you for your question.
Sobre la pregunta de Mauricio del vínculo entre la reforma monetaria y el Mariel, se puede extender ese análisis no solo al Mariel, sino a toda la inversión extranjera, ¿no? Que es una pregunta que sale consecutivamente de cuál sería el efecto sobre la inversión extranjera en Cuba a partir del proceso de reforma monetaria. Entonces, yo distinguiría efectos de corto plazo y de mediano plazo. En el corto plazo, usualmente cuando una economía devalúa su moneda, eso beneficia a la inversión extranjera. Pero en el caso de Cuba no tendría que ser así, porque los beneficios están asociados al uso por parte de la inversión extranjera de la moneda nacional, que no es el caso, y a la posibilidad del inversionista extranjero de pagar directamente los salarios. Cuando se devalúa la moneda, los costos salariales disminuyen. Pero en el caso cubano tampoco es así, y tampoco es así en el Mariel, ¿no? Que se pensaba que en la nueva regulación para el Mariel las empresas iban a poder pagar directamente salarios, ¿no? Se mantiene un intermediario estatal. Entonces, ante ese no uso de la moneda nacional y la no posibilidad de pagar directamente salarios por parte del inversionista extranjero, yo no anticipo ningún efecto directo de corto plazo como resultado de la devaluación y la reforma monetaria, ni en el Mariel ni en la inversión extranjera directa. En el mediano plazo, si todo sale bien, yo creo que habría un grupo de beneficios. Hoy en día, debido a la doble moneda, la economía está como dividida a la mitad, ¿no? Está la economía que funciona en pesos y la economía que funciona en dólares o pesos convertibles. Y esas dos partes no se vinculan. Entonces, la empresa extranjera queda en esta parte de la economía que funciona en dólares y funciona en CUC. Una vez que toda la economía trabaje con una sola moneda, pues creo que hay un beneficio para el inversionista extranjero en la medida que, por un lado, puede vincularse más con toda la economía. Eso le puede ayudar a disminuir costos, ¿sí? Puede tomar algunos insumos de la producción nacional y eso puede ayudarle a reducir costos. Por otro lado, para los que hacen la política económica, ¿no? Para el gobierno, una economía más integrada significa que la inversión extranjera no solo va a tener como objetivo la exportación, sino que además el inversionista extranjero puede estar más vinculado con el mercado doméstico y tener un mayor efecto multiplicador sobre la economía. Hoy en día, la inversión extranjera nada más que está interesada en un segmento de la economía, que funciona en CUC, porque el segmento que trabaja en pesos cubanos, el peso cubano no es convertible. Es decir, si la empresa extranjera tiene una rentabilidad en pesos cubanos, no hace nada con los pesos cubanos, no puede convertirlos a divisa. Cuando toda la economía funcione en la misma moneda y esa moneda sea convertible, pues toda la economía sería de interés potencial para el inversionista extranjero. Entonces yo pienso que ahí estarían los beneficios a mediano plazo. Pero por supuesto eso si todo sale bien, ¿no? Y si efectivamente la economía llega a funcionar con el peso cubano y ese peso cubano es un peso cubano que está respaldado por una política monetaria saludable, ¿no? Con más transparencia, con un mejor uso de los instrumentos monetarios, todo lo que he mencionado en la presentación. Entonces, la pregunta de Zaira, evidentemente, si hay una brecha entre costos y beneficios y los costos en el corto plazo son más altos que los beneficios, ahí hace falta recursos fiscales para cubrir esas brechas. En la medida que el presupuesto fiscal tenga otros problemas, debido a una caída de términos de intercambio, pues habría menos recursos fiscales para cubrir esa brecha que Cuba tiene que cubrirla con sus propios recursos. Es decir, no hay reservas internacionales suficientes, no hay la ayuda de una institución financiera internacional. Por tanto, la reforma monetaria, que es un tema que parecería solo de política monetaria, está muy vinculado a la política fiscal y al diseño de política fiscal que se implemente para darle acompañamiento a todo el proceso de reforma monetaria.
Mario, ¿quiere añadir algo? I think we are coming to the end. I'd like to close with posing one question. It would seem that from both of your analyses and my own, 2014 will be a difficult year. In my analysis, it will be the same tension that you pose in terms of reform and then impact and control and just control will intensify. Therefore, we'll see more of the same stop and go, ambivalence, whatever you want to call this, except I do think that the imperatives of reform are there and that Cuba will continue to reform. But it will be a very difficult year and indeed these issues. Mario, what would be your prediction, your framework? Optimism, pessimism?
No, I want to grab onto Syra asked the question, Director Pavel. Her question was about an external shock, right? What would be the impact on monetary unification or the possibility or the speed or getting there of an external shock? And that's how I look at agriculture too, because of the still high degree of dependency of the Cuban economy on imported agricultural goods. So barring an external shock, I think that you're looking at two tiers of restructuring, right? The institutional restructuring of the MINAG, the Ministry of Agriculture, and then, of course, the experimental calibrated restructuring in terms of, cooperatives, non-agricultural, the commercialization, the supply chain, and so on. But assuming that there's no external sector shock, which no one can really predict, although there are some commodity traders who are saying the winter will be very harsh in the Northern Hemisphere, and that's going to have a tremendous impact on food prices. Okay, and they're predicting that already. If you look at the forward trades in the commodity exchanges, that prediction is being made already. But let's say that they're right about this. The import bill for Cuba would go up, right? And at the same time, you have a deterioration of the terms of trade for the island, because still you have a growing import bill for food. Now, so more pressure on the agricultural sector, more pressure for more reforms, I would say.
Reform. So
Yeah.
you're optimistic about reform?
Yeah.
You are. Pavel.
Yeah.
Pesimismo, optimismo.
No, yo lo que creo es que llegando a 2014, faltarían apenas 3 años para el año 2016 y la proyección, la expectativa del gobierno era alcanzar un crecimiento promedio en los 5 años de reforma de 4.4% y hasta el momento se queda en la mitad, es decir, 2 algo por ciento. Entonces habría una mayor presión en que se está llevando a cabo un proceso de reforma que todavía no tiene resultados significativos ni en el crecimiento económico ni en el nivel de vida de las familias. Entonces este es un proceso que, como decíamos, no es solo un proceso de cambio económico, sino un proceso de cambio institucional que tiene resistencias al cambio y que la única vía que hay para vencer esas resistencias es mostrando resultados. Entonces, yo creo que la reforma va a continuar. El año 2014 creo que tendrá cosas buenas y cosas malas en términos de resultados económicos. No creo que sea peor que este año, pero sí hay esa presión del tiempo, ¿no? Una reforma que todavía no tiene resultados.
En ese marco, ¿cuáles serían las políticas públicas, las políticas de gobierno que ustedes seleccionarían como puntuales? Nada más que dime una o dos.
La agricultura.
La agricultura.
Para ver, la agricultura es pues, donde más fácil se pueden encontrar resultados inmediatos, visibles para la familia. Y lo otro es la pequeña economía. ¿Sí? Cuando uno mira las lecciones de Vietnam, uno piensa que el tipo de unidad económica que reacciona mejor a un nuevo ambiente, a un Big Bang, es decir, a un proceso de cambio drástico, es la pequeña unidad económica. Entonces yo siempre, hace ya algunos años, llevamos proponiendo que la reforma puede tener 2 velocidades. Una velocidad más lenta en la empresa estatal, que es más difícil la reforma ahí está el tema de la reforma monetaria, pero la reforma puede ser más agresiva y manejar una velocidad más rápida en la agricultura y en lo que es el trabajo por cuenta propia, la pequeña empresa. Entonces, si yo quisiera, si fuésemos a hacer una propuesta de aceleración de los cambios para obtener resultados a corto plazos significativos, lo ubicaría ahí, agricultura y pequeña empresa.
Mario, ¿tú?
Yeah, I would say, well, it's a biased opinion, right? Agriculture, but based on one thing, it represents officially 5% of the labor force. But if you add up the indirect contributions of agriculture to
it's
GDP, it's close to a quarter of GDP, and the whole country is agricultural. Everywhere you go, it's agricultural. So
I think I would subscribe to what you have both mentioned. I would add, perhaps as a provocative thought, that I do not recall any successful major monetary reform without outside the support of, and you mentioned this, Pavel, in your analysis, support of outside forces. More often than not, whether we like it or not, international financial institutions. Cuba doesn't have access to those institutions for reasons that have to do with the relationship with the U.S. as well as other things. I would say that what I would like to see also happen in Cuba, besides what you've added, is some process whereby some realism settles in, both in the international community and Cuba, whereby the need for mutually kind of synchronized action takes place, and Cuba can benefit from the advice and the support of international institutions. And that may include changing U.S.-Cuba relations, but which would have to be negotiated. We are running out of time, and you can take 1 minute each one of you, and then we may or may not have time to answer. Yes, John.
If you read my Havana Note stuff, I think we're close to Alan Gross' solution. If we have an Alan Gross solution, then a lot of other things change in the bilateral relationship. And we see the concrete situation of this banking problem that has been put off for 2 or 3 months, the problem of the Cuban intersection not being able to have a bank account. And that may not be solvable without a change in the way OFAC is going after the way Cuba deals with dollars internationally. And that also could contribute to a structural change. Now, I'm known to be over-optimistic, but I think that there really is something afoot at this point. And whatever one makes of the handshake, I think it's symbolic, though I don't think that's why it happened.
Peter, 1 minute. We are running out of time.
You talk a lot about the need for international banks, but nobody's mentioned the embargo. What is the effect of the embargo on all these changes, especially what Pavel is talking about?
Well,
And how can you have this kind of cooperation when the international lending institutions can't do it because of the embargo? And I think that's kind of the elephant in the room that nobody wants to see.
Well, we haven't addressed that issue in this particular panel. We'll address it in the, well, no, we are not afraid of any
You
part.
mentioned it too just now.
Yeah, I just did. And we will return to it. Yes, 1 minute, please.
Yeah, my question is all related to what people have said, and is you were mentioning Vietnam, and Vietnam, of course, is not so free as they say an embargo, and it's a lot of investment in Vietnam by the USA and many other international institutions. So my question is, we know already that in 2018, at least that's the progress, is no any more Castro. So is any institution, is any subtle political dialogue, not political dialogue, but economical dialogue to facilitate the transition so that Cuba don't need to go through what happened in the Soviet Union? And most Americans are disgusted, but all those oligarchs and all those things that, that's
All right.
happened after a sudden collapse of the economic. So is any way that, is any interest by the USA and the Cuban part to work together, as you were saying, so that Cuba can have a transition that is not so dramatic?
We register the concern, we shared much of it, and we will return to that issue in the weeks and months to come. There's a powerful and increasing anti-embargo lobby here today, and we welcome it, and we look forward to engaging you in future debate. As of now, we're going to close this event, and we want to thank all of you. We want to thank Pavel and Zaida and Mario.